Hi everyone and welcome to session 6. I just want to begin by saying it was brilliant meeting you last last Friday. I'm recording this just after meeting you last week, the first weekend of March, and just want to say that it was really helpful and really good having the discussion that we had in regard to this module and getting the feedback from all of you. It was really helpful, so hopefully it'll help shape the next few lectures as well, and I'm really looking forward to meeting everyone again. There's some really good knowledge and a real keen interest in learning about youth work from everyone in the group, and I think it's great that we're able to share different experiences and that we're coming from different and similar contexts. And I suppose that leads me on to what I'm going to do within this session, within these couple of sessions now for week 6. So basically the next few slides I'm going to talk about the similarities, the differences and the similarities between the two countries in regard to youth work. So far we've looked at Greece, we've looked at Britain, and we've looked at Ireland and how they've carried out youth work in the past. And now I'm just going to spend the next few slides just linking what some of the similarities are in regard to youth work amongst the three countries, and maybe what some of the differences also are. This is just a brief overview of what some of these similarities and differences. And when you have done the readings, and hopefully you've looked at most of the readings at this point in regard to the history of Greece, the history of Ireland, and the history of the UK, and you might also highlight some more differences and similarities that maybe I don't look at or address in these next few slides. So have a think while I am going through it, and think about the articles that you have read. So as I said, this session is comparing and contrasting youth work in Ireland, the UK and Greece. And I think it's just helpful to maybe for us to just re-engage with our past and with the history of youth work. And I remember last Friday I brought up, how long have we had youth work in each country? And I know we had a small discussion in regard to, what is work with young people and what is actual youth work. So there might have been activities with young people in the past. There might have been youth clubs, but in what bracket is it youth work, and in what bracket is it actually youth work approaches and youth work practices, as opposed to just working with young people? And I suppose that's what one of the key differences is as we move on and as we're looking at youth work as an actual social practice. So we had youth clubs in Ireland, we had various activities with young people happening within the three countries, such as scouts, youth clubs, girl guides, things like that. But were they just services that were set up for young people? Were they just activities that were set up with young people? Or was there acknowledged practices actually happening there? And I suppose in reality there were practices happening there, but how much they were actually identified by the people carrying them out and acknowledged as actually particular forms and approaches within the setting for young people is debatable. And over the next session, the few slides, we look at where youth work is now in the three countries, and following on from that, we look at what have been identified as actual particular youth work approaches within sociology and within the sociological environment. So I hope I'm not speaking too fast. I'm conscious that I sometimes run away with things, so I hope I am talking clearly and slowly enough within these sessions as well. It's just something that I'm conscious of when I was listening back over a few of the older lectures that I have done so far online. So some of the similarities, and these are hopefully ones that you've already highlighted yourself, and again I know came up in the discussion when we were chatting in Dublin last week. So as we could see, all three started from that charitable, voluntary, philanthropic background. So all of them, so whether it's Britain, whether it was Ireland, whether it was Greece, started with actually the key influencer of working with young people were actually the church, were the middle class coming from that charitable voluntary background. So like we saw, Ireland was very similar to Britain. The reason for this is because we were under British rule until 1922, until we became independent, and therefore we had a very much a similar background in regard to how things were being run and what services were put in place. Therefore, youth work, working with young people, working with those in need, working with the working class, was carried out predominantly in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, by the wealthier class and the more affluent class, who were working from this charitable religious perspective, where they wanted to try and help and save, and I suppose they were generally on a mission to try and help the working class, but help the working class also to become more pious and become more church going. And so by helping them with their daily needs and setting up different services, it was hoped that they would also become more church going, become more pious, and lead to a more religious society. So whether that was from a Protestant background or predominantly a Catholic background within Ireland, this was the background. And it was also the case as well within Greece, because at the time, like we said, Greece had the War of Independence, and after that, so many of any services that had been there, or anything that they had in place, had not been existing or was decimated after the war. So again, the state weren't the first to get involved in responding to badly needed services for children and families. It was the church, and the church set up a lot of these services, such as the vocational schools and the orphanages for young people. So that was something in common amongst all three countries. Class was evident. As we said, class was very evident. So it was generally the more middle to upper class, the more affluent, that were turning around. They would have had more money, they would have had more time to do this type of work, and therefore, as we can identify, there was an agenda behind doing the work. Not to say that they didn't want to do the work, or not to say that they didn't believe in the work that they were doing, but at the same time, there was an agenda behind why they were doing the work, because they wanted to try and create a nation that was more church going and more pious, like we said. So they were initially the biggest influence, and through their work with families, with the working class in general, they established youth work. So they established youth work, community work, and social work within Britain and Ireland specifically. And then within the three countries, working with young people was established as a form of social endeavour. And then, like we said, one of the other similarities, which I've just mentioned as well, is that Greece and Ireland began shaping youth work after wars of independence. This wasn't the case, obviously, in Britain, but in Greece and Ireland. So there was very little there for people after the war, as after any wars that have happened in history. There was little money, little resources, and people needed to start rebuilding and building new services and establishing new services for the people of their country. And the first to respond to that, like we said, were the people coming from a church background. So moving on, the state gradually became more involved in youth work then as we moved on. So this was another similarity between the three countries. So as we saw, in the 1900s, the early 1900s, in all three countries, it was predominantly the church. And then as we moved on, at different points in time, the state became more involved in the youth work that was happening. So we saw this happen first initially in the UK in the 1960s, that the state became more involved and that a statutory youth service was set up. Within Ireland, we saw the state involvement became more prominent, not actually until the 1980s. I'd mentioned the Costello report earlier in earlier lectures. That was one of the key reports that was involved that really began to acknowledge youth work in Ireland, and the need for youth work in Ireland. And it was the same then in Greece also, youth work and the need for working with young people. And youth work in particular was acknowledged again not until the 1980s within Greece. And policy and legislation was being created within Britain and Ireland between the 70s and 80s. And like we said, Greece created Secretariat of Youth in 1983, which is interesting because that was when the Costello report came out in Ireland, which first also acknowledged youth work. So a lot of similarities there. Some of the differences following on from the similarities is that, like we said, Britain actually had the first report. So it wasn't, like we just said, until the 1980s that Ireland and Greece were acknowledging that youth work was something that needed to happen in their countries. But this was acknowledged first in a British context with the Albemarle report. And because of the Albemarle report, you had the creation of a statutory youth service within Britain in the 1960s and the 1970s, which we saw became known as the golden era, the golden age of youth work within Britain. The church, unlike the other two, remained a key influencer in youth work until the 1970s. So it was up until the early 1980s. We saw that the church were predominantly the ones that were running and supporting youth clubs and carrying out youth work within an Irish context, whereas this wasn't as much the case within Greece into the 90s and the UK into the 1980s. And then what made Greece and youth work in Greece more distinctive as opposed to the other two was the fact that a lot of youth work within the Greek context was, as we saw, driven and shaped very much in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s because of the presence of a dictatorship. So the dictatorship there at the time, the monarch there at the time, saw actually, again, this goes back to agendas and the different agendas that were present, but the Greek monarch, the Greek dictatorship during those 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, as a lot of you will know, particularly the Greek students, saw youth work as something that could be beneficial to the future of the country, could be beneficial to, how Greece would be shaped as it moved on into the future. So I suppose it was a case of getting young people, getting getting the population of the country early and getting people when they were younger to buy into how the dictatorship or how those ruling Greece in the 30s and 40s and 50s wanted the Greece to be shaped and wanted the country of Greece to look like. So it was a case of getting the youth of tomorrow on board with what their aims and objectives were as a government and as a monarch. Okay, so what we're going to look at in the next session now will be so where are Britain, Greece and Ireland now? So where have they come? Where's the topic of being professional and voluntary come into that, and how are we running youth work now in all three countries? So we look at that in the next session now. So, but just to say, if you could just do the quick quiz as usual before you move on to that next session, that'd be great. Thanks very much.